Let me just share my screen. Here we go. So I assume everyone can see my screen. And so this little brown decay snake, unfortunately, Ruth found it on the road, and it had been presumably struck by a car, maybe a bike. And so Ruth did a really awesome thing and moved it off the side of the road in hopes that it would recover on its own. And she noted in a video that it wiggled around a bit, and she just kind of left it hoping that it would do fine. But unfortunately, she comes back 30 minutes later and finds it's not moving. So Ruth watches this snake for the next couple of days and sees it's not moving, but its eyes are still open and bright. And she's wondering, is that normal for the snake to try to move away after being injured? The injury in the video looked pretty severe. And if it's normal for the snake's eyes to remain bright and open when it's presumably dead? And these are awesome questions. So while I don't have a super strong background in snake rehabilitation or snake injury, my understanding is when a snake gets injured, their go-to is to try to seek shelter and hide and see if they can recover on their own. So I assume that's what this snake did after being struck. But unfortunately, the injury seemed to have been too severe and it did not survive. And its eyes did remain open and bright for the following days because snakes actually don't have eyelids. So most mammals like us, we have eyelids, we blink and open and close our eyes, and that helps our eyes not dry out, and it protects it from things entering our eyes and maybe irritating them. What snakes have all across their body are scales, and they actually have a scale that covers their eye. So while a snake isn't blinking or able to close its eyes, it still has a barrier protection for its eye. And so, long after it passes, those eyes will remain open because they simply can't close. What's pretty cool about a snake's scales is they will actually shed them all in one go once they're, they kind of periodically will shed their scales. So if we think of our skin cells, we're constantly shedding them everywhere we go, but a snake will shed them all in one piece at, various times of the year. And you can actually see that little eye scale when they shed their scales. So pretty cool adaptation that snakes have to keep their eyes from mechanical damage or drying out. And I hope that answers your question, Ruth. Checking in on the chat, it looks like Mary has a question for us. She says, I watched your trail open video of the trail from the covered bridge along the river into the Arboretum. Excellent. Can you give me a better idea of the total length it would be? Thanks. I'm not super familiar with that trail, Sean, if you know the answer to that.
Yeah, well, so there's a new trail called the Arboretum Side Loop, which links a currently existing trail, I guess both sides of the river, the Aramosa River, near York Road. There's a trail on the north side of the river, and then there's a trail on the south side of the river that's been historically called the James Street Trail. And what this Arboretum Side Loop does is it hooks the James Street side trail through the Arboretum side trail into our Arboretum trails. So basically it's creating this huge network of trails that you can wander throughout the city. So the actual Arboretum side loop itself, it winds through the forest a little bit. It's not very long. The exact distance, I'm not sure, but it's probably no more than about 200 meters when you actually incorporate the curves and things. The actual length of the trail it connects to, the James Street section, which runs from Gordon Street all the way to Victoria, is, so that's probably a couple kilometers long. And then of course, once you get into the Arboretum, we have several more kilometers of trails that you can continue walking on. So yeah, you can essentially make the hike as short or as long as you want.
Awesome. And I see in the chat that Linda sent in an email as well, and she has a picture attached to her question. So let me go back to sharing my screen again. Here we go. So Linda has this awesome yellow birch tree on her property, and it is about 7 feet wide, I believe. And she's wondering, how can you tell the age of this tree, if that's possible just by looking at it from the outside?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the best we can do is an estimate on this. And actually, Michelle, I'm not sure if you can cycle back to that previous photo there. So what I'm noticing is that it is a multiple trunk tree. So basically at the base, there was multiple branches or trunks that have kind of fused together, which makes that measurement of the trunk look a little bigger than it is. Now, mind you, yellow birch can actually, of all the birches in particular, get quite big and quite old. I've seen some very, very, very large trunks on trees that were well over 150 years old. That one, I'm just basing it upon others of similar age that I have seen, and kind of taking into account that codominant branching at the bottom. And I would say that might be anywhere between 40 and 70 years old. And again, that's based upon some trees that I know that are about 40 years old that would have a general height and size and kind of limbs about that size as well. So that's the best estimate I can give. Certainly looking a little more closely, being on site, looking at that tree, you can actually, that's a little bit harder as the trees get older, but you can count backwards. You can look at new growth and twig extensions, and then count backwards to where that connected the year before, the year before, the year before. The older the tree gets, it gets harder, but you can do an estimate that way. And then, of course, what foresters would do, or people studying dendrology, they would use increment bores and taking a core sample, about a pencil thickness outside of the trunk of a tree. And then you can actually sand that down, clean it up, and count the rings. And we use that usually for bigger, older trees. But I would say certainly it is under 70 years old, probably in the 40-year range or a little bit more.
That's so cool. And I see a Facebook coming in, a question coming in from Facebook. Keith asks, I planted some eastern white cedar seeds this spring, and seedlings are currently 1 to 2 inches tall. Will they survive under the winter cover of snow?
Yeah, so are they in, I guess the question would be if they're in pots or not, or if they're growing in the ground. White cedars are very tough, so you've got that going for you. First of all, they're very cold hardy, and the snow cover, that insulative layer, always helps for sure. And I'm not sure if you have more of those details, Michelle, but what I would say is if it's in a pot, usually what I would suggest is, because the pots, especially if it's a plastic pot, they can't really obtain moisture from the soil around them. And they're sitting on the ground, then they're a little bit more exposed to the elements. So what I would do in that case is dig a little small pit, maybe at a sheltered side of your house or near a fence or something. Just a very shallow pit, just enough to kind of sink the pots in so that you can then cover them at ground level. And put a little bit of chicken wire or hardware cloth around it, and then you can actually loosely stuff some oak leaves or sugar maple leaves in, and that'll help create a little bit of an insulative layer as well. And then the snow on top of that, when you have it, is great. Sometimes it disappears midwinter, and it can be a little harsher on seedlings. So that is great when you have it, but that other kind of little bit of leaf protection will help a little bit more as well. If they're in the ground, then that's great because they're already rooted in. They're able to access moisture through the winter, even little micro amounts as the ground freezes. And then again, the snow cover is fantastic, but if you can give them a little bit of that leaf litter just to keep that insulative layer in, they're tough trees, so they should be off to the races next year.
Awesome, and it looks like it is in the ground. I got it from Keith on Facebook, so.
Great. Yeah. So
awesome.
The toughest thing for them is if they get the really harsh winter winds, it can dry them out. And that's when you see cedars, even bigger trees, sometimes 5 feet tall, when they're transplanted later in the season and they don't have enough time to get their roots completely set. And the winter winds come and they basically desiccate or dry out the branches, and they can't pull moisture up quickly enough. So the key is to kind of, keep it moist, not wet. And if you can actually provide some sheltered protection for those little green needles or scales at this stage of their life, then you'll just prevent that from happening, and they should be good to go.
Awesome. Another question we got sent in. So person is looking to buy a good reference book for grafting nut trees onto fruit trees, and their local bookstore didn't have any good recommendations, so we were offered as a recommendation. And so they were wondering about a good book and cost, and maybe where they could purchase a good reference book for that type of grafting.
Right. That's honestly a good question. I've been doing grafting for a few decades myself, and I can't think of any recent books that I've looked at or referred to. Some of the techniques are kind of timeless for sure. So there's a lot of old texts out there. As far as newer ones, outside of a simple Google search, which I'm not that much more helpful. I'm just kind of guessing as much as you would be. There are some places that specialize in growing nut trees and fruit trees. So Grimo's Nut Nursery down in Niagara, so that's spelled Grimo, is an example. And also Silver Creek Tree Nursery, and there's one escaping, Whiffle Tree Nursery. And they also sell grafting resources there, so tools and supplies, and they might have some good book recommendations, maybe some even available on their websites. So that would be, if I can help it just a little bit, that would be a path to lead you on, and you might find something really good.
Perfect. Another question coming in on Facebook is, Kathy has some Redbud seeds, and they're wondering if any preparation is needed before they can plant it, or if they can just do direct seeding.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you can definitely do direct seeding. And what you'll find with Redbuds is that, let's say you have 100 seeds and you throw them right in the ground, and assuming they don't get eaten by anything or taken away, you may have a handful pop up the first spring. The rest of them are going to sit there. They have a really hard seed coat. So what we do at the Arboretum to try to basically increase the rate of germination, so that uniformity, is we'll actually give them a hot water bath first of all. So hot water bath is, we put the seeds in a jar, just like a mason jar, something that can tolerate hot water, boil some water in a kettle, and then pour that water onto them. And that water instantly cools, but that moment that it hits the seed coat, it actually softens a little bit. And if it works, what you'll do is you'll let that water cool overnight, and next morning the seeds should have swollen. If they've swollen, it means that they have basically had their hard seed coat softened, so scarified, and then they are ready to germinate after they go through their cold period. In some cases, they'll germinate quite soon after that, but you can put them in the ground and have them go that way. The key is, don't put the seeds in boiling water. So don't boil water in a pot and then put the seeds in, because you will cook the seeds. Essentially that way, you'll boil them to mush. So it's actually boiling water separately and pouring it on it. Commercially, with really hard seed coats like that, a lot of the legumes in particular, so honey locust, Kentucky coffee trees, black locust, to grow them in large numbers, you're using sulfuric acid, which is not easily attainable and not super safe. So obviously it's good to have kind of workarounds, and the hot water trick actually works pretty well with Redbud, because the seed coat is pretty thick and hard, but not super thick. So usually one treatment of that hot water is enough to break that seed coat, and then they're ready to grow.
Another seed question is this a good time to plant pawpaw seeds?
Well, yes. So pawpaw seeds, if you have fruit and you've just collected the seeds, if you leave them out too long, you will lose them. So the viability, basically the ability for the seeds to remain sound and fresh, it does not last very long on pawpaws. There's other types of trees you can collect the seed, dry them out, and store them for years, plant them years later, and they grow. But pawpaws, once they dry out, they're done. So you do have to plant them right away. But the issue with pawpaws, they require a few different periods of what we call stratification. So that's a mechanism of breaking some internal dormancies of the seed to coax them to sprout. And they require a cold stratification and a warm stratification. And in nature, that basically happens. The seeds would get eaten by something, come out the other end, land in a nice moist spot, usually have a few weeks to a few months of kind of warmer stratification. That's kind of a moist, warm environment in the fall. And then they, instead of germinating right away, if they did germinate right away, they would be tender and they would die at the first frosts in the cold of the winter. They then have to go through a cold stratification to break that internal dormancy to make the shoot come up. So if you're planting them in pots, you can mimic that by creating a stratification mix, and that's usually like a well-draining mix that holds moisture. So at the Arboretum, we use half limestone screenings and half peat moss, and we make sure it's moist, so you can basically squeeze it and not have moisture dripping out of it, but you can definitely feel there's moisture there. We put the seeds in there in a essentially a freezer bag, and we leave them out for a month on the counter in a spot that's not getting direct heat or sunlight, and that's a bit of a warm stratification. And then we'll put them in the fridge. You can put them in your crisper at home and put them in for about 3 to 4 months to break the internal dormancy. And then you can bring them out, take them out of the bag and put them in pots in the spring, late winter, depending on what setup you have. And then they will start to grow. So the other thing with pawpaw though that people give up on is that they don't grow right away after you've seeded them in spring. Some seeds, once they've had that dormancy broken, they will sprout within a week. Pawpaws can take about 2 months. So the temptation is to say, they didn't work, I'm going to throw out my pots. You just have to be really patient with pawpaw. But to answer your question, yes, plant them right now, either in stratification, or you can actually plant them outside in a spot and protect them well from rodents and let nature take its course. It might take 2 years for them all to sprout, but certainly don't let them dry out too much this time of year.
And back to the redbud questions, is should they plant them now or in the spring?
The redbuds? Well, I guess two things. If you're going to use the hot water technique now, you'll need to plant them right away. And that can actually be planting them in pots and then putting them in the fridge, or putting them in a bag and putting it in the fridge to keep them kind of dormant. Or you can, the difference between pawpaws, you can collect the redbud seeds now, and they have a hard seed coat. They don't dry out nearly as quickly. So you can just keep those seeds in a kind of paper envelope like you would your vegetable seeds that you order, keep them over the winter. And then when you're ready in the spring, then you can do the hot water trick and then plant them after that. And then they start to sprout from that period.
Lovely. More questions coming in on Facebook. What are some good trees to grow in hedgerows of field that can grow crops for cattle? It seems like a lot of trees have poisonous branches or fruits.
So fruit for cattle or for branches for cattle? I guess I'm wondering with leaves or things like that. So I think of kind of classic hedgerow trees that you may see in Ontario anyways, and we'll exclude the invasive ones like buckthorns and things like that. But classic hedgerow trees are things like white cedars, hickories and walnuts and hawthorns, serviceberries, basswoods, black cherries, and things like that. And depending on what you would need for the cattle, some of those leaves are toxic, some of the fruit are, but some are completely fine to consume. I actually think of growing up where I did in the country, and we had Manitoba maples, which are kind of considered to be a bit more invasive in this part of the province, but I know the cows really enjoyed eating the foliage on those. It seemed to be fine. Hawthorns themselves, the fruit is certainly edible. They're fantastic trees for pollinators, for birds and everything else. Whether the cattle would touch them or not because of the thorns is the other question. So, as you asked that question, I'm kind of having 100 species of trees running through my head and kind of thinking of logistics, but I'm certainly not an expert on what is the best feed for cattle in that standpoint. So if there's any follow-up kind of details or questions to that, let me know, and then I'll try to fill you in a little bit more.
I'll keep an eye out for that.
Okay.
Another question with a picture. I'll go back to sharing my screen. I believe this comes in from Jim, and Jim's in the Muskoka area. This is a white spruce that's growing all of these growth. It has 2 pictures attached to it. And they're wondering, what are these growths?
Well, those are burls, and burls are caused by, basically burls are kind of a woody tissue that has basically differentiated plant growth. So something has caused it to grow in a weird pattern. The grain grows differently than the typical part of the tree. And usually it's caused by viruses, bacteria, sometimes insect damage, and the resulting will be this, weird kind of burl-like growth. Burls can be quite common. So when I say quite common, there's something you will see, sometimes big ones on trunks. There are ones that are specifically caused by species of bacteria that will infect small wounds in the tree, and then they'll actually change the DNA of the tree in that localized area just a little bit to make the tree create these growths, which essentially become homes for this bacteria. And others can be caused by especially looking at the photos here, it could be by insect or infection by fungus in small wounds that actually causes the tree to have these differentiated burl-like growth around those areas. Now, what I would say is, despite them being common enough, I mean, seeing one with this many burls in it is not super common. And Jim, you sent these photos in a few days ago. I actually showed this particular one to a few expert friends I have who deal with this kind of stuff, and they know burls well, but they were quite impressed to see that many in the tree. And as far as exactly what causes it, in this case, we could speculate it might have been a fungus, or it could have been insect feeding many years ago that caused all these burl growths to start forming and continue to grow. So you wouldn't have even really noticed the first few years after it happened because they'd be small, but they just kind of keep expanding over time. And as you may know, burls can be very valuable to woodworkers. There are burls on spruce trees out west that can be absolutely massive. So there is that kind of interesting quirk to it. As far as what to do about it, really nothing much. The damage, if there was any wounds that were caused, happened a long time ago in this case, and they're continuing to grow. Obviously, if the weight becomes so much that it's causing branches to kind of fall down and fail, there might be some pruning that needs to be done in the future, but there's really no risk of it further infecting, the other trees around it in any way that they wouldn't already be exposed to, essentially. So yeah, it'd be nice to go back in a time machine and be able to observe exactly what was happening when these started to form, and then you know the exact answer. But at this point, I would just say enjoy it. As weird as it looks, they can look like imperfections, but I look at this, and you mentioned there's other spruce trees nearby that don't have them, so appreciate this really quirky, cool burl-filled spruce for what it is, and you shouldn't have to worry about its health too much beyond that.
Awesome. That is a really cool looking tree.
Mm-hmm.
An update on the hedgerows and cattle field. So they're not looking for trees that cattle could eat. They just want to avoid trees that cattle can't eat in case the branch or the fruit ends up in the crops.
Okay. Well, then, you know what? I would go right back to what I said before with hawthorns. Now, I have a soft spot for hawthorns. Hawthorns are really interesting plants, and I feel sometimes they're not appreciated, not known as well, but they can sometimes be a little bit trickier to find for sale, but that's increasing a little bit. And the beauty of hawthorns is they do really form a nice, dense, thick hedgerow, so it can actually be exclusionary to other things. They're quite thorny. They can be dense, kind of twining together. The leaves aren't toxic, the fruit aren't toxic. And again, if you're trying to increase the ecological diversity of the area as well, absolutely hugely important to pollinators and to birds as well. So that would be one I would say for sure to look into. And then again, something as simple as for evergreens, white cedars, for example, which are generally pretty tough trees. They're not toxic either. See, if anything, that they might get eaten a little bit by the cows, because deer do love them as well. But those would be pretty general ones that are, I would call site generalists as well. They can grow in many different conditions without knowing exactly what the soil is like and how dry it might be in your area, or how wet it might be. There's other species that might do better or worse than others, but those would be a couple right off the bat that I would say kind of classic hedgerow native species that would be wonderful to see more of planted in Ontario.
Awesome. Another question about redbud is, someone's coming in with a question that suddenly the redbud has lost a few main branches last summer during a hot spell. All the leaves wilted and dried up, no matter how much they watered it. Are the branches dead, or can they be saved? How do I prevent this from happening again?
Okay, so I'm just gonna recap there. So the tree was freshly planted, is that right? And then some of the leaves wilted and the branches died back?
No, it's been around for several years.
Oh, okay. Okay, so good to have you here, Asha. So you had it around for several years, and it was just a few branches that you saw this on, or was it kind of throughout the tree and just worse in some other areas?
It was everywhere, but on the lower branches.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, there was a droughty period in the summer, but it wasn't, I wouldn't say it was a really, really hot droughty summer, and redbuds themselves are pretty tough. And last year, if anything, 2020 was a hotter, drier year, and it looked fine in that situation.
Yes, this is the first year anything happened to it.
Okay, and when did you first notice the leaves wilting? Was it midsummer? Or
I'm forgetting. There was this about a week where we had really hot weather and no rain. Do you remember that? Maybe in August.
yeah, I think it was early August when we really had that period here.
Yeah.
I guess what I would say is the leaves have since fallen off, but if you take a look at the branches, if they still seem fairly firm, like they haven't got shriveled areas, and even if you take your fingernail and just scratch a little bit on the bark here and there, if it looks good and green underneath, that's a good sign. And if the buds if you look closely, they're very small on red buds, but you'll see little buds. And if they look like they have formed properly, then at this point, the hope is that they'll go through the winter and next year they will bud out normally and everything will look fine. If there was more damage, so after the wilting of the leaves, if it actually started to infect the tissue in the twigs, that would be more of the concern, and whether that would have been a systemic infection from something like verticillium wilt. You'd have to look at the twigs a little more closely to see if that damage was more than just that kind of cosmetic damage to the leaves. So
what you're talking about is a fungus, is it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And you look under the bark, and if there's spots or patches, that's an indication?
Yeah, so where you notice the leaves wilting, this time of year, if you go and you can just even scratch a little bit off with your fingernail or a little bit of a knife, and if you look underneath the bark, you should see kind of more of a crisp whitish green tissue. If it's looking a little bit brown and a little bit mushy in some areas, then that means that tissue is essentially died in that part of the tree. Which means that part won't recover. What you might see is that it might branch from further below and actually come right back and be fine in a couple of years. Okay. But yeah, if it was just a little bit of wilting and the leaves dropped, next year it will leaf out completely fine in the spring. So so if it was just a drought thing and the buds are good, it should be fine. If it was a systemic fungus, then it's something that's a little bit different issue that you have to look into.
About half the branches, and it's a little shrubby thing. It's a lavender twist. It's not a tree.
Oh, right.
Like
okay.
A shrub.
Yeah. And those ones are a little bit more sensitive to some things. I mean, they're, lavender twist and forest pansy and a lot of these really interesting redbud cultivars that are nurseries. They have all these beautiful characteristics, but they're a little bit more tender than the species are on their own. So sometimes they can be more susceptible. But that all being said, if the buds look good and the twigs look healthy still, it should leaf out next year and hopefully again be off to the races if we have a good start to the year.
Right. How do you prevent this if it is indeed a fungus? Or
if it is verticillium wilt, that's a really tricky one. So verticillium wilt is something that can infect all sorts of different tree species, and it can be very sudden. And really, there's not a lot you can do to prevent it. The best you can do really is just make sure your tree is stress-free. So a stress-free tree is better at fighting off any infections that could happen in the root zone, for example. So really keep it watered when it's dry as best you can, but don't overwater. And I usually don't recommend fertilizing too much. I mean, that can seem like it's helpful, but sometimes it can also hurt things if you force growth too quickly. It's not hardy enough. So yeah, generally just try to keep the tree healthy, stress-free. With lavender twist, it is a little bit more cold tender than some other redbuds. So one thing you can do is offer a little bit more winter protection.
Oh, like burlap and stuff.
Yeah, at least for the first few years until it really gets its roots established. And that can be as simple as putting a few stakes in the ground around the tree and then wrapping burlap kind of around it, but leaving the top open. So it still breathes well, but you're basically just creating a bit of a shield for those really cold winter winds. And that just, again, reduces the stress a little bit and gets it off to a quicker start next spring as well.
Right. Okay, good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We'll keep our fingers crossed for your redbud there.
Yes, absolutely.
And we're getting so much engagement on Facebook. Another question coming in: are nightshade berries bad for wildlife? They're not super sure what type of nightshade they're looking at. The berries are dark purple and brown, and dark purple and blue.
Purple and blue. It's a good question because nightshade is a big family of plants, and obviously ourselves, we eat nightshade fruits. We eat tomatoes, we eat eggplants, we eat peppers. They're all in the nightshade family. But then there are fruits in the nightshade family, even on potatoes. So potatoes, for example, we eat the roots underground, but the fruits on the upper part of the potato plant would be toxic to us, as well as some other nightshades, like bittersweet nightshade, which is a kind of a exotic twining vining plant that we see around here. So what I guess I would say is to be cautious, stay away from things if you don't know for sure, or keep your animals away from them if you're not sure. But that answer could certainly be yes or no. I know with my tomatoes at home, I ate very few of them because the chipmunks got most of them first. So that's some nightshades that wildlife can definitely consume, but case by case, it does vary. So always err on the side of caution.
Awesome. And I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat or over on Facebook. So if you do have a question you've been meaning to ask, please feel free to pop that into the chat. We've gotten so many awesome questions for Sean. He's always super popular at these events. But if it's looking like maybe everyone's questions are answered, I want to thank everyone for coming and asking some pretty interesting and really well made me think a lot, probably made Sean think a lot, questions. So really appreciate the engagement and for everyone taking the time to come out and ask your questions. And we will be scheduling another one of these next month. So if you have more questions, you can come out last Tuesday of next month for another one of these events. I do see one question coming in from Ruth. They have yellow tips on a lot of young spruce trees. What might cause this?
Yeah, so if you're seeing yellow tips kind of around the outside edge, what you want to do is look a little bit more closely, and you might actually see that there's been some feeding on the tips by some insects that will actually basically burrow into the twig at the end of the branches. And then that causes the end of the twig to yellow up and eventually brown and die. Now, usually the tree recovers completely fine, but that would be one of my suspicions that you might be seeing there. So yeah, just take a closer look at the base of where you're seeing that yellowing. And if you even actually just prune a little bit of it off and kind of pull back the bark a little bit and see if you see a little wiggly insect in there, that would be the culprit. There are ways to treat it, but usually I wouldn't recommend them, in the sense that, using chemicals to do that is something that causes other problems. So the trees usually outgrow it completely fine as they get mature. They're less prone to that, and even a few tips here and there aren't going to cause you a lot of problems. But take a look for that and see if you see anything in there.
Right. And a follow-up on the nightshade question. So they're thinking it's bittersweet. It's growing definitely as a vine, and they're worried about the birds.
The birds, okay. Yeah, if it's bittersweet nightshade and the berries, they'll sometimes be kind of even turning into eventually to a redder color. I don't know for sure if they are toxic to birds or not, to be honest. They definitely are toxic to us as humans, and I understand things like dogs and things as well. Birds can eat all sorts of things that we can't. So I'll just use an example. I was recovering from some poison ivy, and poison ivy is something that primates get. So us and great apes and gorillas and chimpanzees, not that they're wandering around here getting in poison ivy, but the berries, they can be eaten by all sorts of animals, including birds. So birds can eat things that will cause us a lot of digestive distress. And in the case of the nightshade, they may very well be able to do that. Usually they're pretty good at knowing what they can eat and they can't eat. So again, without knowing specifically, or even if there's certain birds that can handle it quite fine and others that can't. But I would say, bittersweet nightshade is an invasive exotic. It's one of those plants that, we remove periodically from the Arboretum. It's not a horrible invasive plant. It's not taking over areas, so we don't usually worry about it too much, but it is something that we will pull out of the ground in areas that we don't want it, especially our cultivated areas. So, I wouldn't worry about pulling it out if you're concerned about that. But as far as the birds go, they're usually pretty good at discerning what they should and shouldn't be eating. So you should be okay there.
I don't want to give it as 100% yes, but I'm pretty sure some birds can eat bittersweet nightshade. Okay. So that's pretty cool.
There you go. Yeah. Yeah, well, usually with anything that produces like a colorful, fleshy fruit, they're kind of doing that to attract something to eat it and move the seeds. And some things obviously don't want to eat it, but usually there's something out there that can kind of, exploit that for the benefit of the plant and the benefit of the animal.
Definitely. Mm-hmm. more questions coming in is someone's had a lot of oak weevils in their acorns this year. Is there a way to prevent this?
Fortunately, no. And if you figure it out, please let me know. I'd love to know. But no, weevils, there's years where weevil populations can be really high and you can collect all sorts of acorns off the ground and they look good. And then you find out a few days later that the weevils are coming out and the acorns are bad. And especially with big oak trees, that infection is actually happening up in the canopy of the tree. The eggs are being laid much earlier in the development process of that acorn. So by the time they drop to the ground and you start to see that kind of wiggly weevil either inside the acorn or leaving it, that damage has kind of already been done in the canopy of the tree. So like anything, trees that are having a really stressful year for other reasons will sometimes have a big crop that will have more weevils in it. I've visited actually the same tree in different years and had acorn crops that were all fantastic with very few weevils and others where they're almost all full of weevils. So it will vary year to year, but unfortunately there's not really a practical way to eliminate that.
Joan says that she's visited the Arb this summer and she wanted to check in on a couple of trees because the blue Colorado spruce was looking a bit sad and the jack pine in the native tree woods also was looking a little bit not super great.
Okay. Just going back, the blue Colorado spruce, if that's the one in the World of Trees collection, yes, there is a needle cast disease that does impact spruces. So we are losing some of the needles on the kind of lower parts of that tree. Again, it's one that's hard to treat. So that is one that, as that tree grows, we may see the canopy be a little bit higher as it matures. As far as the jack pines, especially in the native tree collection, jack pines are always tricky for us here because they really don't typically like our soil, the pH in particular. So they prefer usually to grow in more sandy or granite-based soils that are a lower pH, more acidic pH, and well-drained soils. And we kind of have heavy soils here with a really high pH. So being an arboretum, we're trying to plant things from all over Ontario, all over the world, put a label in front of them and show people these things. And obviously with the site we have in our little corner of Guelph, it's just not perfect for everything. So we are trying to get away around that in a few ways. One thing that I've done more recently in the past couple of years is I've collected some seeds from some jack pines that are growing on limestone bedrock. So limestone, very high in calcium and magnesium, just like our soils here, so high pH. So my hope is genetically that those trees, as we grow them, will be a little bit more able to handle our pH here on our site. And so stay tuned for that because it'll eventually end up in our native trees and our conifer collections as well. But yeah, that's just one of those species. Jack pine, pin oaks, sassafras. There's a few of those that we have here, but they always just kind of struggle a little bit. They don't love it here. And you can amend the soil a little bit. You can change the conditions, but when it wants to be a big full-size tree, there's only so much you can do. So we always recommend picking the best tree for your site situation. And when we're the Arboretum, we're still trying to have all the trees. Some of them, it's just not the best choice, but we do the best we can to show them to people.
I find it super interesting how much work you guys do to bring the trees that don't necessarily want to live here and have them survive here. I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Joan has a few more questions,
Sure.
noting that it would be pretty cool if we had signage for the age of trees, if that's possible.
Mm-hmm.
Signage is always pretty cool. I think we try to add more signage as often as we can. And they're also wondering what happened to the Frances Bell Rose collection at the Arb.
All right. Yeah, I can answer both those questions. So as far as signage goes, and you kind of mentioned signage, updates on signage that we need to do too, and whether it was a COVID issue. And it's a couple of things actually. So we actually have a new machine, a new label machine that would produce all of our plant labels. And we actually weren't able to use it for a couple of years, being out of our maintenance building and a need to, it's a fancy enough machine that needs special kind of exhaust conditions. So we had to basically put our work on pause for a little bit, and then COVID kind of exacerbated that. So we're actually in the process now of making a whole bunch of labels and updating parts of our collections. And if you visit our World Trees collection, you'll notice one half of it actually has brand new labels with new icons marking which are native trees, which are endangered, updated family names and all that kind of stuff. So that's a kind of a big process for our 400 acres and for our thousands of trees, but we're actively working on it because I'm the same way. If I go somewhere and I see a really cool plant, it's like, oh, what is that plant? I want to see. And there's no label there. I totally understand. You want to be able to understand what you're looking at. With regards to the age of the trees, that's a little bit trickier for us. We do have a few examples of that in the Arboretum, and one is our OAC 56 Park in the Garden, and the other is some larger plaques we have in our maple collection. And in the bottom corner of those plaques, it will say this tree germinated in 1983 or whatever it was. What makes that tricky to maintain when we have tens of thousands of labels is that if we lose a tree, for example, we can't reuse that plaque because the age would be incorrect, and in some cases the plaques can cost quite a bit of money to produce. So having a bunch of generic plaques, we can make sugar maple plaques, for example. We can make a few dozen of them, and we can put them in different collections. And if we lose a tree for whatever reason and we have to replace it, we can take that label and go put it on another sugar maple, and the information is still relevant. So it's one of those things we always wrestle with how much information to put on a label so that it can be useful in different situations. Because surprisingly enough, the labels for us, the cost definitely does add up. So we do want to make them as useful as possible, but we are trying to find these kind of unique situations where we can put those on, and that I'm sure will happen again in the future with some kind of special collections. And speaking of special collections, the Francis Ball Rose collection, as far as what happened to it, it is going to be undergoing a large renovation. I guess I should say it already is right now. So if you've been visiting it lately, you'll see some kind of tarps on the ground covering some old areas. We're actively removing some plants. We're cleaning up old areas. And we're going to be doing some replanting over the next couple of years. And the Francis Ball Rose collection itself was a collection of roses, but it was part of a bigger collection called the Rosaceae, or the rose family. And that includes all the members of the rose family that we sometimes don't realize are very closely related to roses. And that's things like crabapples and pears and spireas and potentillas and hawthorns and serviceberries and cherries and all these amazing plants. And we really want to update that entire collection for a few reasons. A lot of them are very beautiful. A number of them require some conservation work, so they can be rare in the wild, and we want to have a chance to do that archival conservation work here. But the rose family is a huge group of plants that are represented as native plants in Ontario. And one thing that we love to do is bring people out to see these plants, to teach workshops so that you can see them all in one spot and then go back out on your hikes and understand those little subtle features to tell the different hawthorns apart, or the different serviceberries apart, or the different roses apart. So over the next couple of years, you'll see a lot more happening in the Francis Ball Rose collection as far as things coming out, renovations happening, and new things going into place. So just, I would say, stay tuned. It's going to be really exciting. I'm very excited for it. We have right now in our nursery, in our seed cleaning room, we have dozens and dozens of species in the rose family that we've got new seeds from that we're starting to grow. Some that you'll probably not see anywhere else in any other botanic gardens in all of Canada that we're going to be getting out there. So it's going to be fun.
That sounds so exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Another question we have is, someone has a lot of black spots on most of their red oak trees, and this tree is about 30 feet high. Is that a problem? They also had a lot of Lymantria dispar, or formerly known gypsy moth caterpillars, on some of their trees this past summer, and they're wondering if they'll be back in greater numbers next year. They did a lot of work removing those caterpillars with burlap and putting them into buckets of water and soap.
Right. Well, yeah, with regard to the moths, what I would say is that we had a couple years, this past summer and the year before, that were kind of peak for the population of those moths here in this part of Ontario. What has happened is that nature always usually finds a balance. Sometimes it takes a lot of time, but there is a virus that has been going around that has been knocking back the populations of gypsy moth. So you'll actually will have seen that later in the summer when you saw little caterpillars hanging on the trees, kind of half dried out and dying, and the population of really took a tumble because of that, but also the egg cases that you would see on the tree trunks this time of year. They're still out there, but not nearly as much as we saw last fall. Last fall, I was kind of scared, to be honest. It looked like, oh, there's going to be so much out, and there was. But the population is starting to go down a little bit. So I think what you've been doing to try to remove them and with the burlap, that's great. And I think next year, the trees will have that chance to recover a little bit, leaf out normally. There'll still be a bit of feeding, but not nearly as much. As far as the black spots, I can't comment exactly what that would be. There's a number of different fungus and bacteria that can cause spotting on trees, in particular oaks. In almost all cases around here, it's quite cosmetic. So there's nothing you have to worry about as far as a systemic infestation or fungus or disease that's going to kill those trees. In most cases, I would say if I looked at an oak and I didn't find a few spots on some leaves or a few nibbles on some leaves, something would be wrong because they're host to so many things, and usually this ecological balance is quite sound. So there's usually going to be some spots and usually a little bit of nibbling, life continues, and they recover quite fine from it. So I really wouldn't worry about that too much. The bigger concern for oak trees at this point is a foreign pathogen that is now on the borders of Canada called oak wilt disease. And oak wilt disease, different symptoms, but it's similar to what occurred with Dutch elm disease in Ontario many decades ago. It's a fungus that gets into the tree and rapidly causes the leaves to basically wilt mid-season, kind of brown, dry up, wilt, and then kind of moves through the tree and can kill the tree quite quickly. And the Canadian Food Inspection Agency has found oak wilt near Windsor, so not quite in Canada, but an island in the St. Clair River just across the way. So, sorry, that would be the Detroit River, I guess I'm thinking of. So anyways, that is something to keep an eye open for, but black spots is not a related symptom to that. So at this point in Ontario, there's not really a concern with that. So I'd say what you're doing is great, and your oak should be very, very healthy for years to come.
Awesome. Another question in Zoom is, what happened to the tea garden area in the Arb? Not looking to attend again, but perhaps, they're wondering, is it closed because of COVID?
Okay, well, I guess my question, Joan, would be if it's the tea garden area that's part of our Indigenous tea garden area near our Gosling Wildlife Gardens, or the tea garden as part of our Japanese garden, because they can both sometimes be referred to as the tea garden. And I guess what maybe I can do is I can answer for both. If it's the Indigenous tea garden near our Gosling Wildlife Gardens, COVID has been definitely a challenge. It's a garden that's maintained by volunteers. So it is a group of students from the University of Guelph and from some other areas that come in and maintain it. And it has been a little bit tricky the last couple of years to do things at the level that I think everyone wanted to do. But that certainly is going to continue to ramp up in the future. If it's the Japanese tea garden in our Japanese garden, I guess the most recent development is we're having to replace the bridge. So if you're walking in there now, you'll see that we barricaded it because there's no way to cross the pond into the main part of the garden. So the bridge and pond updates are going to be happening hopefully as soon as we can get to them in the spring. We're working with a few contractors on that. The gardens themselves, what you can get to, are still being maintained, and actually we've done a number of new plantings this year. And obviously our goal will be to keep everything tidy and healthy as best we can as we're doing that bigger kind of pond and bridge renovation that will be happening soon. So not sure if that answers your question, Joan, but please feel free to ask any more and I can fill you in.
Awesome. We have a question in from Rick on Facebook, and I'm going to put this in the chat for you, Sean, because I guarantee you I'm going to pronounce this incorrectly. But any comment on woolly alligid and spread in hemlocks in Ontario?
Yes. So hemlock woolly alligid has been, I guess, discovered a few times over the years, the last several years in Ontario, and it's been, I guess we want to say it's been the attempts to quarantine it to prevent it from spreading further in Ontario. So it is an insect. It's a little tiny insect that actually has kind of a fuzzy white coating. And that's where the woolly name comes from. And they will feed on hemlock trees. And in the US, the eastern US, they've caused a lot of mortality. So killed many, many hundreds of thousands of hemlock trees. So obviously it's a thing that we don't want to continue to march this far north into Canada. And it was first discovered in Canada in the Etobicoke area. I want to say maybe 8 to 10 years ago now. And the Canadian Food Inspection Agency went in, removed trees, tried to quarantine the area, felt that everything was fine. It was then found in the Niagara area, in the Niagara Glen area, and that's an area that's actively being monitored as well. And it has more recently been found a little further west along the shoreline of Lake Erie. So it is kind of working its way into Ontario. What we don't really know is how far it will march and whether there'll be limitations with how they survive our winters as they move further north. But the Canadian Food Inspection Agency is doing monitoring in several parts of Ontario every year. So they're actually going into healthy, large stands of hemlock, and they are essentially throwing little fuzzy Velcro, almost like tennis balls, into the trees. And they've actually determined that when you put them into the canopies of trees, they're really good at picking up the adelgids. So the balls come down and you can actually look at them and see if there's adelgids on the balls. And this has actually even happened in our own Arboretum Nature Reserve. We had the CFIA this year, and they were doing that monitoring. And so far, good. We don't have any adelgid here in the Arboretum, and we want to keep it that way. But as far as it's spreading, that is something that the CFIA is just going to have to continue to monitor. And obviously, we're going to have to be really careful as we move hemlocks, especially in the nursery trade or moving firewood or anything else like that might spread things from one area to the other. The challenge is that birds can move them as well. So a bird can land in a hemlock tree and they can stick to feathers and then they can fly to somewhere else too. So there's a little bit of just kind of fingers crossed and monitoring as best we can and trying to isolate any infestations as quickly as possible and then trying to quarantine them.
Well, I guess good news that we don't have them so far. Knock on wood, we keep that up.
Mm-hmm.
And it looks like those were all the questions popped into the chat and on Facebook. So we really got a lot this time, Sean. Thank you so much for answering basically all of them. And thank you so much to everyone who tuned in on Zoom and Facebook. All the questions were super interesting. I really like to hear the answers. Hopefully we got all of your questions answered. And if that's all from you guys, if everyone's questions are answered, we will probably leave it there. But again, if you have more questions next month, we will be hosting another one of these events on the last Tuesday of the month. And so maybe we'll see you guys there again. I hope you guys have an awesome rest of your day. And thanks again for joining.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.